Before I turn over my presentation to my colleague, Tiffany, I want to sort of acknowledge the number and the alumni who've been attending. We had approximately 21 states who registered for this. They represent, all states: Alaska, Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, California. I do want to say it because it's so impressive. Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Missouri, Mississippi, New York, Ohio, Oklahoma, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia, all 21 states, and over 27 classes who registered. So thank you very much. Again, this topic is about interviewing, a skills workshop, and I want to pitch this over now to my colleague, Tiffani Martin. Tiffany?
Thank you, Keith. So give me a thumbs up if you all can hear me clearly. Awesome. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and we will get started. Like Keith mentioned, we are going to have a Q&A at the end. However, if you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to just drop those in the chat, and either Dan will answer them if it's something quick, or we'll save it to the end and we'll answer for the entire group. All right, so yes, this is about interviewing. That's why you're here. I know that we have mostly alums in the group, but we may have also some current students in the group as well. So I'm going to be talking, a lot of my focus is going to be for alums. However, this does apply to current students as well. So keep that in mind. And I want to start off by saying nobody's perfect. When I think back to when I interviewed for this job that I have now, I cringe at some of the answers. And I often wonder, how did I get this job? Because I'm supposed to know this stuff, right? This is my job to know all of this. But nobody's perfect, right? And interviews are stressful. And there's always that moment where you go back and think, oh, I wish I'd said this, or I'd said this differently, or I hadn't said that at all. But it takes a little practice, even for those of us who are alums and have done this a lot, and some of you may have. When I work with traditional students, so current students, even recent grads, there's a lot of confusion as far as interviewing is concerned. I think many students haven't been through interviews very much, and if they have, maybe it was back when they were in high school, or just a part-time job, or fast food, or retail, or something like that. In many cases, those interviews are very, very informal. So going through a formal interview for them is daunting, and they don't really know that they should practice. They don't really know how to practice. Now, you guys, like I mentioned, you all probably have done this a lot. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to practice. So I seriously doubt that there's anybody in here, and if there is somebody in here, I'm so sorry, but there's anybody in here who has interviewed, regularly, like every week, or, it's not something we do on a regular basis. So we do need practice. Things change, and that's a lot of what you're going to hear today. You'll hear me give an example of something the way it was 20 years ago when I was interviewing folks for a previous position that I had. And then you'll hear me talking about kind of the way things are now. So, the interview questions themselves change, the logistics of the interview, all of that can change, how long the interview is. I've heard of people going through day-long interviews. That's a lot of stress over an 8-hour period. The types of questions that you'll get, those change. How you should answer something, how you shouldn't answer something, all of that changes. Now, I mentioned that practice. We're going to touch on some of the basics of interviewing. We're going to talk about some questions that you may have heard before, questions that you may not have heard before. I'll give you some examples. But it's always good to practice. And keep in mind that the Career Services Office is here for you. As alums, as current students, you can always come to us, call us, Zoom. We can do it however you like. And we can sit down and do a mock interview for you, give you that practice that you need. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so let's think in terms of kind of the basics of interviewing. You all know that the purpose of an interview is for that interviewer to check two things, to check and see if you're going to be a good fit for that position and for the company, and also to follow up on the information that you presented in your resume. Now, I can say, having been an interviewer in the past, for example, I worked for a state park for many years, and I was a hiring manager for our tour guides. They were seasonal tour guides, and they would come in, they'd give tours of caves. Sometimes we had tour guides that came back year after year, which was awesome, but most of the time I was hiring a new set of tour guides every year. And for me, the most important thing wasn't whether or not they knew the science or they knew the history of those caves. It was, do they have the personality to do this? Can they stand up in front of a group of people who they don't know and talk about that science and history and do it in a relaxed way? You know, we didn't want these to be super formal and stuffy presentations, and you're walking with them at the time. So it was really a matter of, are they going to be a good fit for this job? That was so much more important to me. I could teach them the science and the history in no time flat. So yes, that is certainly the point for the interviewer, those concepts. Now for the interviewee, I think in the traditional sense, a lot of people think, well, the only reason I'm going to this interview is so that they can torture me for an hour and ask me all these questions, and I can be super nervous. But that's not it. It's not just for the interviewer. That interview is also for you. You need to check and see if you think you'll be a good fit for that organization, for that job. And of course, you need to make your pitch, and it needs to be a pitch that separates you from the rest of the crowd, everybody else that's interviewing. Here is a short list. I'm going to go through this briefly because I think you all already know this, but I said I'd hit on some of the kind of standards for interviewing. We all know that we need to research, do your homework. Take a look at the company online, look at their website, Google their name, go to glassdoor.com, find out what other people who have worked there or people who currently work there, what they think of the job, what they think of their supervisor, what they think of the company. All that stuff is on Glassdoor, and it's very, very helpful. So check that out. You can also go to LinkedIn and find out a lot about the company and about some of the people that work there through LinkedIn as well, assuming, of course, that they have an account. So the more you know the organization, the better prepared you're going to be, and also the more serious you appear when it comes to interviewing for the job. So this next one, understand your narrative. That's kind of a tough question. We're going to expand on that a little bit more, but think of that as your elevator pitch. And so, like I said, I'll expand on that here in a minute. Have questions ready to ask them. As you do your research, you should come up with some questions, jot them down on a piece of paper, keep a list. If you show up to an interview, you get all the way to the end, you've done really well, and they say, do you have any questions for us? And you say, nope. That is an indicator to them that either you really don't know much about the job or the company, or you just really don't want the job that much. So make sure you have questions. Also, make sure you know where you're going. And I think this one gets passed over. I've had multiple phone calls from frantic candidates who were like, I can't find your business. I can't find the office. So do a little bit of homework in advance, pull out your phone, get your map app out and make sure you know where you're going. If it's a phone call or a Zoom call, make sure that you've got a solid connection and you have a place where you're going to be able to do that, to take that call and have a little privacy. And of course, dress the part. First impressions are important. So now I want to move into a little bit of some of the more modern things that are going on now with interview questions, interview techniques. There are several different ways to interview people, and there are new ways popping up all the time. One of the more traditional ones is kind of this soft skill assessment, and you'll see a lot of just general HR recruiters will use this technique either by phone call or a Zoom meeting as maybe a screening call, right? Where they'll ask you some behavioral questions, very generalized questions, just to kind of find out a little bit more about you. I'll give you some more examples of behavioral questions here in just a bit. So that's a little bit more traditional, but then you can move into things that seem a little non-traditional. Working interviews, this is basically on-the-job auditions. Not on-the-job training, but on-the-job auditions. Larger companies sometimes can do this where they have a pool of candidates and they choose 2 or 3 of them and they bring them in and they put them to work for a week. So you are literally, that's like the longest interview ever. You're literally on the job auditioning for the position. Casual, they call it casual, but it's casual but anti-casual in my opinion, because if you're having an interview over lunch or over coffee at a coffee house, you're being scrutinized not just for the answers that you give or the way you present yourself when you're sitting there face to face with that person, but they're looking at you as far as how do you interact with the waiter? How do you give your order? How do you deal with if there's an issue with your order? How do you deal with that? So it's not quite as casual as it might sound. Virtual interviews. This is also a lot of times this is tech companies will do this. So they'll have the VR headsets or augmented reality AR, and they create these almost like a game that you go through, and it's this real time, here's a problem, and you have to react to it with the headset on, like in game. So again, mostly tech companies are doing that, but a very, very modern way of interviewing. Video, so either live video like we're doing right now, like Zoom, which has become obviously much more popular now with the COVID issue. But also one-way interview or one-way video interviews, which would be pre-recorded. Those are kind of interesting. I've been through one of those a while back. They give you a series of questions. You have 60 seconds or whatever their time frame is to answer the question once you hit the record button. And sometimes you can scrap that. You can play it back and see how well you think you did. You can scrap it and maybe try again. So you get 2 or 3 tries, and then you just submit those, and that's like a kind of a pre-test type of thing. And then group interviews, which are my absolute least favorite. I've been in one and I've done one. Typically when they're filling multiple positions, you can see group interviews, although it's not really the best interviewing technique that I've ever run across. So those are some different scenarios that you may run into for an interview. It's always a good idea to ask whoever it is that calls you or emails you and is setting up the interview for you, to kind of give you an idea of what the interview setup is going to be like, okay? Just so you know a little bit in advance. Types of interview questions. So we have 3 basic types. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about direct and behavioral. I just briefly want to mention case-based because these types of questions are probably everybody's favorite, right? You know about your industry, you know about the work that you do. You can answer questions that are like scenarios or problems that relate to your industry or to this particular industry. So, and a lot of times they're not necessarily looking for a correct answer, but they're looking for how you approach that problem. An example might be, can you tell me the appropriate technique to test for lead in a stream? Very case-based, very dependent on that particular job, right? It's give me this technique, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What steps would you take when working with a patient who's been diagnosed with a communicable disease? Another one that is kind of a mix between case-based and behavior. A coworker's out sick indefinitely, and you've been assigned 12 of their open cases. How do you manage your time to accommodate this? So those are some examples of case-based questions. But I want to focus mostly on direct questions and behavioral questions. Direct questions are very open-ended. They tend to be very conversational. These are some samples here. The tell me about yourself question. You can pretty much guarantee you're going to get something like that at the beginning of the interview. Why did you choose this field, this industry? Why did you choose the major you did? Why are you interested in this position? Why are you interested in this company? Those are all direct questions. The tell me a little bit more about yourself question. This is one that, like I said, you can plan on having this question. So knowing in advance it's coming gives you the time to make some notes, do a little practicing. This is kind of like that 30-second elevator pitch. It doesn't have to be 30 seconds. We suggest writing down some bullet points. Don't write out an entire, minute-long speech and memorize it. You can talk about yourself, right? You can. If you just have those prompts in your head, then you can talk about yourself. You don't need to memorize. So think in terms of prompts. Think present. Who, where are you now? What's your career status? Past, where'd you come from? What did you come from? What were your interests at a young age? What was your major? And then future, what are your professional goals? If you can think of in terms of those 3 bullet points and keep it to that, because a big part of this question is, are you going to ramble and ramble and ramble about yourself? You shouldn't do that. We're talking 60 to 90 seconds. This shouldn't be a really long, drawn out answer. This is just the introduction. If you're an attorney, you're going to have to make an opening and closing remarks. Here's your opening remarks. If you're writing a paper in your English class, it has to have an introduction. This is your introduction, okay? Another example of direct questions, the one everyone hates, this is what we would call a negative question, is what is your greatest weakness? That's how it used to be phrased. A lot of times now you'll hear, what's an area that you need to improve upon? You want to be honest, but you don't want to be too honest. And I put Robin's story. This is an actual, based on an actual employee that I had, but it was 20 years ago and I cannot remember her name. So we're just going to call her Robin. Robin's greatest weakness as her supervisor was that she didn't show up to work on time. Now, had Robin in her interview, when I asked her that question, said, I never show up to work on time, I would not have hired Robin, but she didn't. So see, she wasn't too honest with the answer. With these types of questions, you want to choose something that's not really going to impact the job. It's maybe a non-essential skill. Now, in order to do that, you've got to dissect that job description, right? You need to know, okay, here's what I need to be able to do. And it sounds like maybe these other things are not super essential. So maybe I choose a weakness out of that list, right? You don't really necessarily want to go with a past. Well, you definitely don't want to go with a past weakness because that can, right now I would say I'm kind of a more of an introverted person. Sounds ridiculous saying while I'm sitting here in front of who knows how many people. Keith is laughing, but Dan knows what I'm talking about. But I used to be much more extroverted because I talk to people all the time. So I wouldn't say, oh, I'm super introverted when I was actually more extroverted. Another example, let's see. For me, another one was public speaking. I was not super great at public speaking until I got into the outdoor education, which is where my background, where I come from, environmental education background. So that's when I was talking to people all the time. And so once I got to that point, I didn't really have that fear of public speaking. But I wouldn't list now public speaking as a fear because it's not. It's a past one, but it's not. So they want to know something that you have going on right now. And most importantly, that what you're doing to address it. You never end your answer to this question with, well, I never show up to work on time. And no, you have to, if Robin was going to give that answer, that poor girl, she could not get to work for the morning shift for the tours. So we tried to help her out. She kept sleeping through her alarm. So we tried to help her out. We put her on 1 o'clock. She slept through that too. So if Robin had, said, I never come to work on time, she could have followed it up with, but I'm working on that. So here's what I'm doing. So I have my phone with my alarm set. It's right next to my bed. Once that goes off, 2 minutes later, I've got another alarm clock set across the room. Once that goes off, 3 or 4 minutes after that, I've got another alarm clock right outside the hallway on a little table. So I have to get up to go turn that off. If I go back to bed after that, I've made this wonderful contraption that's in my hallway, and it lights a cigarette lighter right underneath the smoke alarm. So 7 or 8 minutes later, the smoke alarm goes off, and you have to get up for that, right? So I hide the stool where so I can reach the smoke alarm, so I have to be awake, right? So that is her telling me she's really trying to fix this problem, right? Obviously, I would never recommend that being an answer to the question, but you get the point. Other things not to say. I can't think of anything right now. This is potentially a question, so have a weakness, have a strength in mind. Don't ever tell them you don't have any weaknesses, because we all have weaknesses. They know it, you know it, everybody knows it. Also avoid the overused answers like, I'm a perfectionist. The answer that you try to make it sound initially like it's a weakness, but really it turns out to be beneficial. Perfectionist, great, you'll do everything right the first time. Or the I'm a workaholic, I'm a workaholic, and they think, great, you'll do all the work we need you to do. Those aren't weaknesses. Okay. Strengths, much easier question to answer. What are you complimented for by your friends and your family, your employers, professors? What do they tell you you're good at? Think of the answers that you can put into some kind of context, something that's going to relate to that particular position. And if you can, provide an example. I have one here I just randomly found on Handshake. This is with Midway USA. It's an HR-related position. And I just started highlighting here some of the keywords in this introductory paragraph is great for finding these keywords. So interested in the outdoors, hunting, shooting industry, fast-paced environment, working to help others. Those are all great words. And I would be thinking in terms of, okay, do I fit into any of these, or any of these be, could this be a really good strength for me to point out to them during my interview? I could say that I'm really great with multitasking. I like to be working. I like to always be working, right? And I'll go from one thing to the next thing, oftentimes without needing assistance from a supervisor, if I'm allowed to do so. I could say, from my past experience, I could say I come from a background of working with outdoor recreation, outdoor equipment. I was even a certified hunter education instructor through the Missouri Department of Conservation. So for the knowing the product and knowing a little bit about the industry, I would have that background. Those are all strengths. And again, they pertain specifically to the job that I would be applying for. So those are some examples of direct questions. Some examples of behavioral questions. These are the ones that people groan, and try not to groan in the interview, actually, because you want to, just do it internally. Anything, you all know past behavior predicates future actions, right? So they're going to be asking you questions about these past behaviors to see what your future actions might be. Some of these are more popular. I mean, you'll hear this almost constantly with professional recruiters who are like doing screening, right? So they'll call you up. They don't know a lot about the actual job itself, about like any case-based questions that they could ask. So they're going to go with some of these behavior questions or the direct questions from before. So you might hear something that starts with, tell me about a time when this happened, or please give me an example of this. So 2 examples you see up here. Tell me about a time that you worked with a team. Tell me about a time when you were able to identify a problem and resolve it before it became a major issue. These are very open-ended. And if you are not prepared for these types of questions, you're just going to stare blankly at them because your brain is trying really hard to deal with the fact that you're under the pressure of the interview situation itself. And on top of it, now it needs to find an example in your past and pull that forward and spit it out as an answer to this question. So I want to take advantage of our chat option here. So as I go through, I'm going to show you a method on how you can answer these questions. As I go through that, if you recall a question like this that you've either had during an interview yourself or that you've posed to a candidate, any type of tell me about a time when questions, throw it into the chat, and we'll take a look at those just in a second and share with everybody. This is the method that, and this is, we used to actually do this as the STAR method, but I like adding the T on the end of it to make it the START method, because I like that last step. So with this, when you're coming up with your answer, you're going to have that scenario in your head. You're going to have to recall that situation. The first step is describe that situation, the S. Then what was your role? What was the task that you were completing during that situation? That's your T. What action did you take? Not anybody else. What did you do? That's your A. What was the result of your action? That's your R. And then the last T, connect the dots. So tie that story to this position that you're applying for. You can say, you know, and I think that the way I reacted in this situation would certainly shows my skill at blah, 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 which relates to this job. You can come up with, you know, 4 or 5, 6 different scenarios based on these types of questions. If you Google, let's see, behavioral interview questions, you will find tons of these. They're all over the place. There's a lot of different examples, and hopefully we get a few here in the chat. But you can pull from professional experience, from volunteer work that you've done, any community activities that you've done. If you're a recent graduate, academics, just, you know, anything you could think of that is, if it relates to that position really well, that's even better. Okay, so let me, I don't have my chat up, so. Where did it go? Dan, do we have any, for some reason I'm not seeing my option to bring up the chat. I think I'm looking at the wrong thing. Do you have any?
Nothing in there yet.
Nothing yet. Okay, guys, better be thinking. Gotta be thinking about those questions. All right, so when you're actually in the interview itself, obviously you're answering questions, you're going along, you're getting through it, you're trying not to sweat too much, you're trying not to fidget too much. Some of these things here will come up. So you've given an answer and you're done giving your answer, and there's this uncomfortable silence. And so your brain says, say something, right? So you say something. So now your interviewer, who was taking notes during that uncomfortable silence, is now like, oh, now I got to start writing again. So they're taking more notes. So don't feel like if it's quiet that you have to fill the quiet. It's okay. Usually that just means that the interviewer is still taking notes. It's totally fine. Answer everybody in the room. Use eye contact. Very important. One of the #1 things, crucial tips for interviewing, and you'll see a slide on that here in just a sec. If you're in person, obviously, you know, even though one person is going to ask you the question, if there's 4 people on the panel, you just want to kind of take turns looking to each person as you answer your question. If you're on a Zoom meeting, just don't be looking down when you're talking, right? A lot of people, you know, they've said stare at the camera, but to me, it's like this one-eye thing with a blue light on. It's not a person. I can't talk to it. So, but I do try to make sure that I'm keeping my head up and they can see my face. I'm typically looking at the other person on the screen right below the camera, right? So keep answers relevant, keep answers concise. Don't ever say just yes or just no to a question and leave it at that. You need to expand. Even if it sounds like it's a yes or no question and they don't say like, and why, or can you please explain? Still, please explain. And then stay positive. You will still get some of those negative questions like the weakness question, right? You'll still get things like that, but you need to try to answer those in the most positive way that you can. Also keep in mind, this is not a time for you to bash your current employer or previous employers or supervisors. They don't want to hear that. So keep it positive. So here are a few, these numbers are not correct. I'm sure this is old, but the actual items here are still current, even if the numbers are. Common nonverbal mistakes made during job interviews. So not making eye contact, not knowing anything about the company, never smiling. Yes, it's stressful, but you still have to smile. Bad posture, right? If you're slumped over, It doesn't look, and if you look at the picture there, she's got her arms crossed, which is has a negative connotation. So it's best not to do that. Just check your posture. And you're fidgeting too much. I always talk with my hands a lot. When I'm in interviews, I put them under the table. And if I need to fidget and squeeze my thumb or whatever it is, I'm doing it under the table and they can't see me. Okay. Statistics show that first impressions are determined by three things. The most common thing, which now again, numbers probably aren't the same, but I'd say the order on these is probably about right. The way you dress, the way you act, the way you walk through a door, the quality of your voice, your grammar, your confidence, and lastly, the words you actually say, right? So your answers to the questions, okay? So there's a lot of stuff in there. First impressions are really important. And there's a lot of stuff in there that has nothing to do with your answers to the questions, okay? All right, couple more things here, and then we're gonna open it up to some questions and come up with some additional sample questions for you. When you're interviewing, we're starting to see a lot more of these kind of screening phone interviews. During COVID, there were a number of interviews that were just flat out phone interviews, and that was the only interview. If you can't do an in-person, or if you get one of those screening calls, there are some things you need to think about. It's not necessarily going to be easier, okay? Phone interviews in particular, these are typically done when they're screening candidates. They don't want to bring everybody. They may have 20 candidates that they like from their initial look at the resumes, and they don't want to bring all of them in. So they a lot of times will have an HR rep or an HR recruiter call these people and go through this screening process. You need to be prepared. You need to be somewhere quiet. Close the door. Don't have the dog in there or the cat in there with you. Have a good connection. So if you're on a cell phone and there's one place in your house where it works best, go to the one place in your house. Kick everybody else out. And then bring notes. They cannot see you at all, so you can have your notes with you. You can have questions written down, things like that, so you don't have to think about that stuff. Then also keep in mind that your voice, the way it sounds, your inflection, your enthusiasm, all of that comes through over the phone, but there's no picture associated with it. So they can't see you smile. They need to hear it. And then people have tendency on a phone, even more so than in person, to ramble because you can't see visual clues. You can't tell that that person is on the other end of the line is taking notes. You just keep going. So time yourself, kind of pace yourself a little bit, and keep in mind that it's a different setup than in person, okay? Same thing applies with virtual interviews, so like Zoom, Skype, Teams, all of that. Those are becoming much more popular as formal interviews now that thanks to COVID-19. Again, make sure you're set up in a quiet place. Test your connection in advance. If they're using a platform that you're not familiar with, you may have to download that software onto your computer to use it. So I've had that happen a lot of times with Zoom, with students who hadn't downloaded Zoom yet. They were late getting into the meeting because they had to download that. Again, you can bring notes, but don't have them to where the interviewer can see you looking at them or taking notes or whatever. You just kind of set them aside so they're not visible. In this case, since you are going to be seen, make sure you're dressing the part from top to bottom, okay? Don't be wearing sweatpants and a nice shirt because you never know when you might move or have to get up or stretch to reach something, and they see your purple sweatpants down there under your nice shirt. So don't do that. Also make sure that your background is very simple. A plain white wall is good. And that you've got good lighting. I have horrible lighting in this office, but I can't do anything about it. That's why I look green. So this will not be the best place, in my opinion, to interview. Watch for visual clues, because now you can see them, but you're going to need to look at the panel and look at the people to make sure you're not talking too much, you're not talking too little in your answers. Okay, so that is a brief overview of the types of questions that you might get, some preparation stuff, a lot of which you already know, some logistics, pitfalls to avoid, things like that. So what I want to do now is open it up for questions. And if one of your questions is, can you give us some more example interview questions? Because I can imagine that you might want to hear some more of those. Yes, we're going to do that in just a moment. But first, I want to see if we have any questions about what we've talked about so far. So let's see here.
Thank you, Tiffany. Can you hear me, Tiffany?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. Just wanted to sort of, if you are ending, I'm just scrolling here, but thank you very much, Tiffany. That was a very good presentation. I can see why these career workshops are so valuable. I mean, I'm sitting over here taking a lot of notes. I'm not necessarily looking for a job, but they're just great. I mean, you said it yourself, we don't practice this, we don't do this enough, but the kinds of questions you reminded us to answer or have in the back pocket for any kind of interview. And I think it works for a lot of people, but, we need to practice on it. That it's just great to have, great to know, so that when we get into these situations, we'll kind of have a comfort level with answering questions about ourselves. Tell me about yourself, I do want to let everyone see the resources for getting in touch with Dan Gomez-Palacio or Tiffani Martin. They shared that.
Yeah, I'll share it again.
Okay. I'll just do some wrap-up things, and then you can answer the Q&A. I, again, gave a special shout-out to our VP, Suzanne Rothwell, but I want to acknowledge the people who actually run the show here, and that's Kiana Austin. She's the administrative assistant for the Alumni Office, and Carolyn Pruill, she's our Associate Director for Strategic Communication and Advancement. They are not visible right now, but certainly have really been helpful with producing and getting together all of these virtual alumni gatherings we've had. I do want to ask Carolyn, before we get into the Q&A again, to share a few links for us that we have. Again, we are archiving a lot of the topics that we've discussed, a lot of the career workshops that we've had that may be showing up in your chat. Also, from the alumni office, our communication to have you read about what's going on here at Columbia College. That is through our Affinity magazine or any of our CC Connected stories. But I think Carolyn will share with you the link to our Affinity magazine as our online digital magazine. I don't know if you've been aware, but we are currently looking for the CCAA Affinity board members, and we have a nomination process for that. But if you have an interest in serving on our Columbia College Alumni Advisory Council, our board, we are accepting nominations right now. So if you'll take a look at that, that will be great. I'm going to turn this back over to Dan and Tiffany, who led the production and answered the questions for the chat. Tiffany, I think you see a few of them there. Dan has been answering.
Yeah, Tiffany, I'll pose a couple to you that came through the chat. Thank you, everyone, for asking. First of all, someone asked, what's a good way to respond to the dreaded "why should we hire you" question?
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. We'll pop that back up here in a minute. Why should we hire you? So I mentioned the tell us a little bit about yourself as an introductory question. Think of the "why should we hire you" as your closing remarks, as the end of this whole thing. You're going to be summarizing those key skills that you hopefully have already stressed to them during some of your answers, and just reminding them of why you're interested in the position, why you're interested in the company, and why you think that you would be a good fit. Hopefully that, again, these are direct questions, so they can be very open-ended. There is no right or wrong answer. Let's see.
Great. Someone asked, how do you frame questions? How do you frame interview answers in a career transition situation?
I think it depends on the situation. I can use mine as an example. I have a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's in biology. I started out, as I mentioned, working with outdoor education was my thing. So I worked for state parks and for the Department of Natural Resources for a number of years. If an interviewer were to ask me, why are you interested? Dan, I don't remember if you guys asked me this question, but why are you interested in working for career services when you started out, as a environmental educator? And for me, it was telling my story, right? Not the super long version, but the shorter version of how I moved step by step through those different career progressions. For me, it was, I started out in education, and then I was, not necessarily by choice, but I was kind of thrown into a supervisory position for a park. And then from there, because I was hiring and I was doing all of the HR related stuff, and also because of some family situations, I moved into an HR position, still with the same department, but in a different location. And then I moved into the recruiter position for the Department of Natural Resources. And as a recruiter, I was working with interns a lot. It was one of the things that I was focusing on. And that's what this position does a lot of. There's a lot of work with the interns here on campus. So that you can see how that all kind of transitioned to where I am today. So, tell your story. And again, it kind of does depend on what the specific situation was. I hope that helps. Yes, the presentation will be available later. We already answered that one. Why should we hire you?
Someone asked Tiffany, I gave a short answer in the chat, but maybe you can expand on it, about how far back you should relate your experiences from.
Well, yeah, I think it depends on if that experience is really relevant to the job. I talk, like I said, I was talking about a position with you guys just here that 20 years ago that I did, right? So, but it was relevant to what we were talking about at the time. It's a good example. If it's, when with resumes, we talk about going back, 10 years or so, right? On your resume, you can think of maybe the same kind of timeline as far as your answers. But again, if the first thing that comes to your mind is a previous position years and years ago, and it's a good example, then that's the one that you use.
Okay, we got another question from Crystal. Does graduating with honors make a good impression for the employer?
Sure. We posed a question, I think it's been a couple years now, I think it was a Pizza with the Pros. Dan, you correct me if I'm wrong. We asked some professionals from the community if they looked at GPA when they were hiring. And most of them, if I remember correctly, said, well, it's there, we skim by it. If you have a 4.0, yeah, absolutely. If you have honors, absolutely, that's great. However, at a certain point, it becomes more about your skill set than what your GPA was. So if there's room for it on your resume, then by all means, list it.
So to add to that, Tiffany, if you don't mind. So one thing that I encourage students and alumni to really think about is you're trying to put together a story of success and a story of achievement, right? And your grades can definitely be part of that story. Now, if your grades were like mine, it would not be part of your story. I did not talk about my grades after college. But if you graduated with honors, then that is part of your story. And that shows that whatever it is that you put your mind to, you can really succeed in, especially for a lot of you that were juggling jobs, family responsibilities, everything else, and we're still able to maintain really strong grades. That really talks about your ability to focus and multitask. And so it can definitely be part of your narrative. You should, if you are proud about your grades and how you were able to achieve that, that should definitely be part of your narrative and how you describe your experience.
Tiffany, if I may, and Dan, I wanted to circle back with one interview I had actually before Columbia College, but it was an interview over lunch. And as you know, I'm director of the alumni office here, so I'm very forward-facing with alumni and donors and that sort of thing. But the lunch interview really looked at how I ate. I mean, yes, they asked questions and that sort of thing, but making sure that I didn't eat too much with my hands, that I didn't pick my teeth with my hands, because when you're meeting with alumni, when you're meeting with people who want to interface with the college on a different level, again, it's not so much how you eat, that you're using the right fork, yes, but it's that you can represent the corporation or the company or the college in a way that's not all about yourself. I just wanted to put that out there because it was my first interview and I was thrown off by it. I did well, but I just didn't know that those were kind of interviews. He said, let's meet over lunch.
Yeah.
It was more than lunch. It was more than lunch.
Yeah, you think, oh, casual, this will be easier. Not necessarily, no. I want to point out, thank you, Keith. I want to point out a couple of things here because I know towards the end I don't want to forget. So in the chat, there is a WashingtonPost.com link right around the 110 mark. If you guys want to pick that up, copy that and check that out. It is the ultimate guide to job interview questions. It's a really good set of questions, lots and lots of questions. So if you want to, and they update it too. So if you want to take a look at that link, please do. We had questions. Do we do mock interviews? Yes, we do. Do we do resume reviews? Yes, we do. And this is, of course, for alumni as well as current students. So all you need to do, as Dan pointed out in the chat, is contact us. You can email us at careerservices@ccis.edu or just give us a call at the number listed there. There's no charge for any of these services. And then let's see, Dan, it looks like we're at, can you sound too arrogant or confident in an interview? Example question from interviewee to interviewer could be, how important is it to you that this position be filled by someone like me? Or is that too bold? I tell students that don't be afraid of asking what you consider hard questions to those interviewers. I've kind of picked a person on the panel, right, and asked them, how long have you been here? They tell me, 10 years. Why do you stay? They're going to have to think too. It's totally okay. You are interviewing them. When they say, do you have any questions for us? That totally opens it up. So can you sound too arrogant? Yes, you can come off as arrogant in an interview. And that's why practice is important, especially practice in front of another person that you trust, somebody that will go, ooh, don't do that. Don't say that. But don't be afraid to ask tough questions to those interviewers. It's totally okay. Dan, any input on that one?
Yeah, I mean, remember with interviews and resumes, like you're the first person to tell them that you can do the job. They don't check your references first. Typically, you have to be the first person to tell them that you are a good match for the job. So can you overdo that? Sure, you can come across as arrogant or sort of boastful, but don't be afraid to really talk about your accomplishment and really talk about why you're a match. That's the reason for this interview. And a lot of you feel awkward talking about yourself. I hear it all the time in mock interviews. But remember, we have to know. You honestly have to tell us as a recruiter, or you're asking us just to draw our own conclusion. So don't be afraid to really call out your strengths and your accomplishments. That's what the interview is for.
Deborah asked a question about, can you write down interview questions? If you're on a phone interview, obviously they can't see what you're doing, but keep in mind, there are no visual cues as far as those awkward silences, right? You can't tell what they're doing and they can't tell what you're doing. They don't know that you're jotting down notes. Now, if you have, you have those questions where there's like 3 or 4 questions built into one question and you're like, oh geez, I'm never going to remember all 3 of these. Maybe you take a second to jot down a few key points. That I think is perfectly fine, but it's also okay to say, okay, I believe I answered your first 2 questions. Could you give me that 3rd question again? I want to make sure I get all the answers for you. That's totally fine. They know it's a long question. They did it on purpose. They know. Let's see. I went ahead and threw up that Washington Post link again at the 120 mark. Dan, how did you blur your background?
I answered that. So we got another question here. That's a really good one. I've asked an interviewer at the end of the interview to tell me how I could be a better candidate based on what they had learned about me today. Are there other ways to get constructive criticism during the interview or to jump on an opportunity to
address silent objections?
Address any silent objections the interview may not have expressed.
I think that's a great way. That's a great closing question. And I've gotten that before, and that can be a tough question for them because they're, you put them on the spot. It's okay. They may reveal a little bit, they may reveal some things that you didn't talk about that you can then in turn talk about. So I think that's a great way to find out if there's anything you appear to be lacking, if they're honest with you, obviously.
So another couple ideas. So one question that I encourage folks to ask is, what makes a perfect candidate for this job? Just ask them, and then they will list out probably some of the things that are foremost on their mind. And if you think like, ooh, I didn't talk about that one thing that the interviewer talked about, you can say, well, that's great, because I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but throughout my job, I've had a chance to prove and then you can go on with that. You can also use the thank you notes. And so thank you notes should be done to everyone who took time to interview you afterwards. They can be done written or they can be done over email. And in that thank you note, you don't want them to be too lengthy, but you can certainly reinforce, or you can certainly use that opportunity to cover anything that you felt like you didn't get a chance to during the interview. So keep that in mind as well. It's an important tool.
Yeah. I think there was a question about what should you take or should not take to an interview. Usually you recommend some kind of portfolio or pad folio or, something with a notepad in it. You keep copies of your resume. It's very, very rare that they won't have a copy of your resume, but if you added something since then, you can hand out that more updated resume. I have heard of a situation. I had somebody come up to me at a career fair and tell me that he always takes his resume with him everywhere because he went to an interview and no one on the interview panel had his resume. So he just handed them out. So take your resume, take a notepad, pen. Everybody has a phone. If you're a lady, you carry a purse, put it in your purse and turn it off. If you're a gentleman, you don't carry a purse. You carry a briefcase or whatever, put it somewhere and turn it off. If you have a situation where it absolutely has to be on because of family situations or whatever, at minimum, silence it and turn off the vibration, and put it somewhere, I guess. If I was worried that my kids were going to burn the house down or something, I might have it on the floor where I could see it light up, but we just recommend just turn it off for that hour or whatever. So that's a not to bring thing. Any other questions, Dan?
I don't think so. Those were excellent questions.
Yes, thank you for interacting. So now there were a few questions. So I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you this slide here, and then we just have just a few minutes. If you can think of what's the absolute worst question you've ever gotten in an interview or asked somebody, if you were told later that was an awful question, or what's the weirdest question that you have ever heard during an interview or asked during an interview. If you want to throw those into the chat, we can copy those and create a document, and then you guys can get copies of that so that you have some of those kind of difficult questions to use as reference, some of those weird questions that are starting to happen a lot more now. We've heard the, on a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you? If you want a true weird question. That one's kind of like, define weird. Well, they want you to define weird, so yeah. All right, so here is our contact information one last time. And then for some reason, it won't show me chat unless I stop sharing. So, oh, there it goes. Okay. There was at the top here while you guys are thinking, we did have a couple of examples of behavior questions. Tell me about a time when you went above and beyond for a client. Tell me about a time when you had a disagreement with a supervisor or a coworker and how you handled the situation. Those are always good. Thank you, Linda and Darian.
As I say, I have been taking a lot of notes on this presentation. Now, again, these are fantastic. I want to extend this to any alumni who's here. I'm Keith McIver again with the Alumni Office. If you have any suggestions or would like to see other kinds of presentations by my office to alumni by way of Zoom, this has been a boon for us in a way that we didn't expect in terms of offering the kinds of things we are sharing. Again, the career workshops, we've had 4 this year. We've had about 2 faculty presentations. These are faculty of Columbia College talking about their respective disciplines. We had one from a political science professor talking about the elections. That was in October. We had another faculty member talk about the CSI effect in forensic science. So those were 2. We had, of course, the career workshops. We've had a workshop with our military alumni. If there are recommendations of things that you'd like to see that we are able to present to you guys, again, we are hoping to do more face-to-face and have more alumni events around the country in the coming year. We are opening up and the college is allowing us to visit and have more alumni direct presentations. But if there's something that you'd like to see, any topics you'd like to see, please send those to me. Again, appreciate everyone being here, and of course, Dan and Tiffany on this presentation today. But just holistically, we're doing a lot with our alumni office, but we really want to hear from you. So